Good evening. For those of you that I have not met, my name is Joanne Drake, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Thank you all for coming tonight. In honor of our men and women who serve this nation around the world in uniform, it is our tradition to do the Pledge of Allegiance, so I ask that you stand and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. I was thinking that perhaps the heat and humidity would keep a few people home, but I see that you figured out we have air conditioning. So I'm thrilled that you're here. Before introducing our guest this evening, I want to introduce a special guest of his who came along with him, his wife, Margaret. We were honored to have Margaret here during our centennial year in 2011 with her book on American individualism and the next generation of conservatives, and I believe she visited us one time after that, and we're delighted you returned. We hope you'll come back again. So we want to welcome you on behalf of the Reagan Library and the Foundation. Our speaker this evening is a writer, he's a journalist, a television news analyst, and a political commentator. He is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, which, if you do not have it as your homepage on any of your computers, you should know that by their own description, they deliver award-winning, original reporting, and sharp opinion from big personalities in the arenas of politics, pop culture, world news, and more. I'm told they have more than 1 million readers a day, easily twice as many people that read the LA Times. Maybe that's the Beast part of the Daily Beast. The Daily Beast website describes itself as fiercely independent and armed with irreverent intelligence. Frankly, I was a little confused. I had to read it a couple of times because I thought perhaps they were actually talking about John Avlon. And I think it can be argued that John is both. He's worked for such diverse employers as Tina Brown, the New York Sun, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and CNN. That assortment certainly shows fierce independence, don't you think? He's also the author of a number of political books, including one entitled Wingnuts: How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. That could be the irreverent intelligence bursting forth, I would say. This year he published the book that we'll hear about this evening, Washington's Farewell, The Founding Fathers' Warning to Future Generations. Forgive me for my own irreverence, but that sounds an awful lot like he might also be fiercely intelligent. He does have degrees from Yale and Columbia. John Avlon's Washington's Farewell highlights the history and content of President George Washington's final discourse to the American people in the context of our political climate today. Even if you thought you knew a little about our country's first president, I think you're going to be amazed at how perceptive and prophetic he really was. President Washington did not actually deliver his farewell message as a speech or an address from the Oval Office, like most modern presidents do. President Washington's final letter was initially published in only one newspaper, and no, it did not have the circulation that the Daily Beast has. And instead of promises for the future, President Washington wrote about the forces he feared could destroy our democracy: hyper-partisanship, excessive debt, and foreign wars. Does that sound oddly familiar to anyone? And eerily relevant? At the end of his second term, President Washington surprised Americans by telling them in the first line of the first paragraph that he would not run for a third term. In his own words, and to remind you a little of the formality of American English at that time of our country's beginnings, I thought I would share with you a line. He wrote, "The period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust, it appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now apprise you of the resolution I have formed, to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made." In a lengthy entreaty of 6,088 words, the president offered both wisdom and warning as he went on to call for unity among citizens by birth or choice. He advocated moderation, defended religious pluralism, proposed a foreign policy of independence and not isolation, and proposed that education is essential to democracy. In this address, he also established the precedent for the peaceful transfer of power. This message of our first president has been quoted by his successors throughout our country's history, including President Reagan, who used it in a major speech on democracy in the center of the world's most powerful communist nation, when he spoke to the students at Moscow State University in May of 1988. President Reagan quoted Washington about the role of faith and morality in a democracy, a message no American president had certainly ever dared to spread inside a communist stronghold before or since. I know that John has been a college lecturer on a number of occasions, and I imagine he will bring a little of that to our event this evening. Honestly, though, I'm also hoping he also brings a little of that irreverence to our gathering as well. I think that might help tone down both the formality and length of President Washington's final address and help us to understand it in today's environment. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Avlon.
Thank you all very much. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be at the Reagan Library. I'm one of those presidential library nerds, and I've got to say that I think the vista up here in Simi Valley from the mountaintop over where now Ron and Nancy lay rest is just one of the most stunning places in America. So it's an honor to be here again with my bride. Yes, I married up. To talk with you all today about Washington's farewell address. And that's a real pleasure as well, because just imagine for a moment if we had a memo from the Founding Fathers written for us to help guide us in our decisions as we face the perhaps inevitably stormy prospect of a future. And that they laid out at the earliest days of the Republic the wisdom we should keep in mind when making our own decisions as a self-governing people. The wisdom rooted in their understanding of history up to that point. And that's the great gift that George Washington gave us. The farewell address isn't only an extraordinary document because he establishes the precedent of 2 terms and a president voluntarily leaving power, which was itself a revolutionary act. We forget that because we take it for granted. But that instead of doing a valedictory lap and talking about all the great things he'd accomplished, and many they were, he decided that he would issue a warning to what he termed his friends and fellow citizens. Listen to that one more time, his friends and fellow citizens. I think that's lovely because that's exactly the approach we should have to each other, all of us, as fellow citizens. But he wasn't ever content to rest on his laurels, and he was full of concern about the uncertain future just 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. Civil war already seemed to be a possibility to many. And he had been working on this farewell address for 5 years with the greatest team of ghostwriters ever assembled. James Madison, when he tried to bow out after his first term, and then Alexander Hamilton at great length. And if any of you are fans of the play Hamilton or the soundtrack, you'll note that the farewell address got a brief and welcome moment back in the sun with the song One Last Time, which actually is faithful to some of the lines in the speech itself. But Washington and Madison and Hamilton knew they were writing for posterity, and the warnings they issued were stark. Hyper-partisanship. They understood as a force that had always destroyed democratic republics going back to ancient Greece and Rome. Excessive debt. Debt is a force that has destroyed empires throughout history. Foreign wars and foreign entanglements in our democracy, attempts to influence our elections and our domestic debates. We'll get into more in a little bit. But Washington was ultimately too much a man of action to simply focus on the challenges and the warnings he set. He set forward solutions for us, durable wisdom, renewable sources of strength we could draw on. the importance of national unity when we look upon our fellow citizens across the Federalist patchwork of states, the strength and wisdom of political moderation in a democracy, the importance of faith and religious pluralism and morality and virtue to a self-governing people, the importance of fiscal responsibility, the importance of education, and finally, the importance of peace through strength. These are all articles of faith, first principles, but you'll notice, and I'll make the case, that they consciously span what we view as our political divisions and divides today. That this is a document that deserved its place as civic scripture and retains its ability to unite the nation with a sense of common purpose by defining common ground. And we need that message, I think, now, perhaps more than ever in our recent history. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about how it was written, the core messages, and the afterlife of the idea. You know, George Washington seems so distant today. He's not as approachable as many of the other founding fathers. But he was a fascinating man in full. And when he sat down to write his farewell address, he drew upon all his experiences as a soldier and a surveyor and a statesman, as a farmer, as a self-made man who was really an autodidact without any formal education. And he felt a degree of insecurity about being president, which I don't think we often appreciate today. He was supremely confident as a general, and he understood farming and agriculture supremely, but he was aware that there were others among the founding brothers who had a better understanding, perhaps, of law. James Madison had taken the lead of the Constitution. But only Washington could command the moral authority to unite the fledgling nation. And it was an unlikely prospect at best. You know, conventional wisdom said that democracies were doomed and none could be attempted on a scale such as ours. It had never been attempted before, and John Adams, of course, as vice president, said there hadn't been yet a democracy that did not yet commit suicide. And all the foreign powers in Europe were waiting for this American experiment to fail. They felt sure it would, and they could come swooping back and recolonize this country. There were deep divisions even in the debates over ratification of the Constitution. People who were concerned about the encroachment of federal power, divisions between North and South, East and West. And Washington alone had the ability and the deep intention to try to unite them all. But I want to focus on the dangers he saw before we go to the solutions. You know, it is often, I think, misunderstood how much the founding fathers did not know the success we've seen today. And hyper-partisanship was for Washington a real killer of democracies. He was an independent president. We forget that sometimes. He was an independent president. He was not a member of any party as a matter of principle. And he really resisted the rise of parties. We forget sometimes also that the Constitution doesn't mention political parties. And that was not a simple oversight. Interestingly enough, they thought the division of the government into 3 branches of government would provide the necessary checks and balances. And Washington was very concerned about the rise of political parties, in part informed by the experience of the English Civil War, as well as the ancient Greek and Roman republics. Washington really feared that self-interested factions would hijack a democracy and create such deadlock and dysfunction that it would lead to citizens being frustrated with the efficiency and effectiveness of democracy, and that could open the door to a demagogue with authoritarian ambitions. That was a very clear and present danger among the downsides of democracy perceived by the founding fathers right at the outset. And it really pained Washington to see his 2 most talented surrogate sons, Jefferson and Hamilton, scheme to create political parties against his wishes and against his will under his nose in his cabinet. And when he wrote his final address, he was in physical pain. He was in psychic pain. He was frustrated. And so he was very aware that his warnings against hyperpartisanship seemed to be coming true. And the best he could do was try to urge restraint, that we may have political parties, but it's the duty of a wise people and a just people to constrain that. The political parties may be a natural outgrowth of liberty and democracy, but a wise people must think bigger and constrain their pursuit of power. And always keep in mind unity, national unity over regional divisions. And Washington had a fascinating term for those folks who would try to wear the cloak of patriotism while trying to divide Americans against one another. They called them pretend patriots. Debt is a term that in political debates today has been associated primarily with the right. For Washington, there was a real allergy to excessive debt. He thought it unwise. And Hamilton certainly hammered that home with him. They recognized, and rooted in their experience together during the Revolutionary War, that if a nation didn't have its fiscal house in order, all other things could fall apart. And that was real challenge throughout the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress did not have the political will or necessary muscle to raise revenue for the army. So you had a situation where we couldn't raise the capital necessary to provide shoes and bullets for our soldiers. The British were trying to actually create inflationary pressure to make the colonists stillborn, and they almost succeeded until Washington and Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton got the fiscal house in order. And so this was very much top of mind. He accustomed himself to the Hamiltonian wisdom that a degree of debt could be a good thing for a nation. But excessive debt passed on to future generations was ungenerous. That each generation had an obligation to pay its own bills and not pass on to posterity that which they should pay themselves. And then foreign wars and foreign influence. Washington believed, as Ronald Reagan did, in peace through strength. He was the original articulator of that virtue. The best way to prepare for peace, to ensure peace is to prepare for war. That's soldier's wisdom. Washington also was very focused on us becoming military and economically strong enough to be taken seriously as an independent nation on the world stage. He did not want us to be treated as a satellite of other nations because he'd seen how that had destroyed young democracies before. He was wary of spending blood and treasure during wartime. And it's interesting that we don't even think about the intergenerational financial costs, let alone too often the bloodshed that come with war, but that was very much on the top of Washington's mind. What was really about was a foreign policy of independence. He did not want America to function as a satellite of any other nation. And so he very much warned against falling into the gravitational pull of either England or France. And that was the actual domestic debate that began the two-party system in America. And Washington bitterly resented the revolutionary French government coming over here and trying to convince Americans to throw their lot in with them. And this is what's particularly interesting. Washington had no great love for the British, as you might imagine. But he also understood that there was a lot of wisdom in the British system. As Hamilton once said, we think in English. There's a cultural continuity which needed to be respected. And moreover, there was a deep distrust of the radicalism of the French Revolution. I think this is a little bit of wisdom that's Burkean in its nature, but is sometimes forgotten, that Washington and Adams and Hamilton, the Federalists in power in that first administration, very much wanted to make sure that we walked a durable middle ground between monarchy and the mob. Because they understood that anarchy is always the quickest path to tyranny. And what was really unforgivable in their eyes, and I think unforgivable in the eyes of history, is when the fanboys of the French Revolution, Jefferson and Madison, excused the mass executions that were occurring. Under that logic, we occasionally hear with totalitarian dictatorships, with utopian pretensions, say that you've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, but by eggs they mean human beings. But Washington was not swayed by that, and the French were deeply frustrated because they felt we owed them one. And so they sent a man named Citizen Genet over here, an ambassador, to try to foment really a revolution against Washington, to try to topple his government for declaring neutrality in a war between France and England. So when Washington is railing against the foreign policy of independence, when he's railing against the dangers of foreign powers interfering with our democracies, it seemed a little quaint to me when I was writing this book. It seemed a little quaint that Washington would spend so much time warning that foreign powers would try to interfere with our democracy and our domestic debates. But, of course, we see the way history has a way of coming round, and that Vladimir Putin didn't make up the playbook all by himself. And in fact, that during the time of Washington's administration, the Polish government formed the first written constitution in Europe, a constitutional monarchy. And Russia, at that time, had influenced and bought off members of the Polish parliament under the auspices of foreign aid and good friendship, but really with the goal of having the country agree to a series of partitions to reduce it to a skeletal state and therefore make it weak and ripe for conquering. That was, by the way, a move they learned from, among others, King Philip of Macedon, and that was quoted in the Constitutional Congress by both Madison and Hamilton as a warning sign. The founders drew on history constantly. They knew it was uncharted ground, but the best they could do was draw on history and to learn the lessons of failed republics. And I actually think that's something that Ronald Reagan did exceptionally well. He used history, not an attempt to move us back, but to use history to guide our decisions going forward. And that's something I think we need much more of in our politics today, and the Founding Fathers absolutely drew on that understanding of history. So those are the warnings. Big three. They're relevant. They're urgent. They should keep you up a little bit at night, that the Founding Fathers were warning about things that are ripped from the headlines today. But wait, there's hope. Washington was entirely focused, utterly dedicated to the concept of national unity. He warned in particular against the rise of regional political parties because he felt they might lead to civil war. He said, citizens of birth or choice, everyone here has a right to be called American, but they must put their primarily loyalty to the idea of being an American, not the nation of their birth and certainly not the state from which they hail. And he was a lonely voice in this. He was trying to unite the nation, to create a national character, almost through sheer force of will. But he kept hammering home the two words he uses most in his correspondence are citizen and union. These were still new concepts, but he was trying to enshrine them through the strength of his own example. And he did it over and over again by warning against those people who would try to divide us, even sometimes most sinisterly under the auspices of being a purer patriot than the rest. He understood, especially when he was counseling Jefferson and Hamilton, that democracy depends upon an assumption of goodwill among fellow citizens. That is a lesson that we forget too often. And he was in correspondence counseling these two talented men to try to assume goodwill among each other, and he frankly couldn't quite make it happen. But he knew that was an essential virtue. Political moderation is something that hasn't been in fashion for some time. But again, Washington and the Founding Fathers were drawing on classical wisdom, the idea of the golden mean, the idea that extremes throw a country, a society, an individual off balance. And there's a practical part of that wisdom for democracy, of course, as well. Madison expressed it well in Fed 10, and Hamilton wrote many odes to moderation in the Federalist Papers, but that a spirit of principled compromise, which let's not forget is what the Constitution emerged from, is necessary to democracy. We must find common ground. And that's what makes our pluralism, our diversity, such a strategic asset as opposed to a weakness. If we can find that common ground, that will mean that one faction, majority or minority, can't run roughshod over the rest. It was rooted in the lessons, as I mentioned earlier, in the English Civil War. It was rooted in classical wisdom, but also just the very real practical knowledge that moderation made a society stronger. It made a democracy stronger. It ensured more representative outcomes. That democracy is not about winning all or nothing. It's the opposite. It's the spirit of inspired, principled compromise that moves a nation not left or right, but forward, even as we recalibrate at different times based on different threats, despite all our interesting differences. And Washington was very committed to that idea and that ideal. And that's a bit of founding wisdom we've forgotten in recent years, and I personally would very much like to see it return. Washington's career, Washington's political writings can very much be seen as a manifesto for moderation. And I think they bear up in the eyes of history and the eyes of time. But that's something we could rediscover under the auspices of patriotism. Fiscal responsibility, as I mentioned, is core, and we forget it every day, that there is, in fact, a moral obligation to pay down your debts, that paying taxes will never be popular, but, and I think in Washington has a wonderful phrase, will never be more or less painful, will never be, basically he said, it's always going to be a pain to pay taxes. But you know what? Man up and deal with the math. That's your obligation to future generations. That if you go to war or you make investments, that you've got to pay it down. A degree of debt's a fine thing, can be a fine thing. Excessive debt is dangerous, and it's generationally irresponsible. And that's a message we can learn as well. You know, Reagan, of course, revered the founding fathers and told many wonderful stories, but the excerpt he gained the most from the Washington's farewell address was the section on the importance of religion and morality and virtue. And in this, Washington was actually practical as well. He was not a man of orthodox or sectarian beliefs. In fact, he got in trouble with his local preacher in Philadelphia because he wouldn't take communion or kneel during prayer. And the preacher actually, there's a fascinating story, called him out indirectly in a sermon. And the next day, a senator said, you know, did you hear the local preacher called you out for not taking communion? He said, I did hear that. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm not going to go back to church. But the reason was that he didn't want to be seen as a political hypocrite when it came to using religion. He was a man of faith. He was a man of complex and practical faith, and he, in fact, also drew a lot of great spiritual strength from the Stoics, which is itself fascinating. But what he was passionate about and consistent about was that religion helped a society, particularly a self-governing society, be stronger. And if you want to really hear one of the most beautiful early invocations of faith in a democracy, read his letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, where he welcomes a persecuted people to America without reservation. He says, all you need to do is join our country with your whole hearts, and we will welcome you and respect your differences of belief, because America should be a beacon of freedom for religions around the world. There's a wonderful note he writes to the foreman at Mount Vernon, where he says, you know, we've had some open positions. He said, well, you know, they can be Christian, Jewish, Mahatman, interesting, or of no religion at all. But he did really believe that religion was a practical agent to a democracy because it was the most effective way of teaching morality and virtue. And morality and virtue are foundations for a civil society and a self-governing people. So it's a practical argument for the importance of faith, but it's a passionate defense of pluralism and religious tolerance that remains relevant today. And when Reagan quoted it, as he often did this particular section, but most inspired at Moscow State University, it was a stunning thing to see him speak in a totalitarian nation about the role of faith in a free society. And that retains the ability to inspire, and that light carries forward. Also, education. Washington was the least formally educated founding father. He was sensitive about it, but he was a true autodidact. He loved reading. He did not have the brilliant, sparkling wit of some of the other founding fathers. He could be a bit taciturn. He was a self-monitoring man. He was modest, and he did not like displays of affection or ostentation, partly because he was preserving the mask of command. But he really understood that education was key. Enlightened opinion, he said in the farewell address, is necessary to a self-governing society. And he actually wanted to have a whole section on the importance of education in his farewell address. He put aside personal money to build a national university on land that he helped purchase in what is now the Vice President's house, the Naval Observatory in Washington. And he wanted to build a great national university not only to perpetuate education, but also to bridge regional discriminations and prejudices. He wanted to bring the most talented young men from around the country, and they could get to know each other. They could get to learn each other at a particularly pivotal time in their lives, and that would help cement the states together. So again, there was the goal of building a self-sustaining society, an understanding that an economy depended upon education, that a civil society depended upon education, that democracy depends on enlightened opinion, but also that that would help cement people and make them understand that there's more than unites us than divides us as Americans and human beings. And he was passionate about that fact. Ultimately, by the way, even George Washington couldn't get what he wanted from Congress. Congress would not allocate the money for a national university. And that's why we have the University of North Carolina and the University of Virginia, but not a national university. It's a little bit of a reminder that, even the first founding father didn't get carte blanche with Congress. And finally, peace through strength. And this is a clear overlay with, I think, Ronald Reagan. Too often, Washington's views on foreign policy have been miscast, and I'll get into this a little bit in a second, as an invitation to isolationism. That's not the case. Washington understood the virtues, the unique virtues of our geography in a way that perhaps soldiers most naturally can, but that we often don't see enough today. There's a great quote from another great American whose ranch home is not too far from here, Will Rogers, who said it in a way that perhaps resonates a bit more contemporarily. He said, America has the two greatest friends any nation ever had. You know who they are? The Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And that's the kind of line I think Reagan would have loved. The point being that we were isolated by geography with a splendid piece of land, and that we could therefore not be dragged into every domestic dispute between the continental countries. And that would increase our chances of being a beacon of freedom. That would increase our chances of being an independent nation on the world stage. And really what he wanted, and it's as clear in his correspondence, is just 20 years. He wanted 20 years for the American experiment to grow more solid, economically and militarily. He wanted to have commercial relations with countries around the world, a very expansive anticipation of globalization in some ways, but entangling alliances, though the phrase is not used in the farewell address, with none. He was very careful about the United States not having a sense of permanent interests aligned with another nation's interests. He wanted us to behave honorably on the world stage, to respect our treaties, but to never mistake another nation's interests for our own. And I think it remains good advice. Certainly peace through strength remains good advice. But what he wanted us to do was be strong enough that we could make our own decisions about what was in our best interests. Now, Washington wrote this, and it was published on September 19th, 1796, again, 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. And he wrote it when the Executive Mansion was in Philadelphia, just a block and a half away from Independence Hall. And he had wanted to retire years before, was persuaded not to do it, that the country would degenerate into civil war. This time he was not going to be denied his well-deserved retirement. He called in the editor of a local paper called the Philadelphia Daily Advertiser and offered him the scoop of the century, that he would be voluntarily leaving power. And he worked with his aide Tobias Lear and David Claypool, who published the American Daily Advertiser, and he worked on the document, edited it minutely in final drafts. And then the day it was published, Monday afternoon, I should say, he'd already left town. He was rolling on the way back to Mount Vernon. And in his very taciturn way, he writes in his diary, left Philadelphia for Mount Vernon. By the way, he would never call Washington, Washington, the city. He called it the federal capital. There was a bit of modesty there that I think echoes Reagan. And he says, I announced my retirement today, in effect. It's very taciturn. I'm absent water. Oh, there it is. Excuse me. The fact he chose to publish it in a newspaper, I think, speaks to a little our Republican virtue, too. He could have announced it in front of Congress like a king, or the legislator like a king. He didn't want to do that on purpose. He wanted to speak directly to the American people, and he knew the message would disseminate naturally, and it did. Although fascinatingly, it took it months to get to Kentucky. But he also chose a newspaper which was decidedly nonpartisan, and that's always been a bit fascinating to me because there were certainly anti-Washington newspapers at the time that railed against him in vicious terms. There were also pro-administration newspapers, and he could have given it to one of them, one of his quote-unquote friends. But he chose to give it to an independent-minded paper, independent-minded in part because they had a congressional publishing contract. But I think that spoke to, the virtues he was trying to appeal to. He did not want to be seen as partisan. He did not want to cozy up to a partisan paper, even one that was in his favor. And it disseminated beautifully across the nation. Washington's farewell address, it's difficult for us to appreciate today, was the most widely published document in America for the first 150 years of our republic. It was more widely republished and reprinted than the Declaration of Independence because his friends and fellow citizens understood it to be his parting wisdom that summed up the virtues and lessons and wisdom of his life. And that statesmen for generations going forward would repair to it and use it as a lens on which to judge their own decisions. Thomas Jefferson, who he fought with pretty viciously, if often subterraneanly, when he became president, his inaugural address basically reads like an eloquent rewriting of the farewell address's wisdom, despite the fact he'd fought Washington on policy for so long. Where you stand is often a matter of where you sit, but Jefferson became a born-again Washingtonian and echoed many of those principles, if not all. Andrew Jackson's farewell address is essentially an extended rumination on the wisdom of Washington's farewell address and his warning not to degenerate into secession and separatist impulses. When Abraham Lincoln is running for president, he uses the farewell address as a defense of the newly formed Republican Party and quotes from it extensively in his House Divided speech and others. It's a standard part of his campaign speech. And during the Civil War, when war broke out, Lincoln required that the farewell address be read aloud to troops to remind them what they were fighting for. And in the wake of the Civil War, it was standard teaching in America's public schools as a way of reuniting the nation because people said at the time, if we had remembered this wisdom, we wouldn't have had the war. And so literally generations of students were taught to memorize it. Now this is 6,000 words, folks. They were taught to memorize it and diagram it because the lessons were considered so essential to who we are as a nation, that connection, that direct connection to Washington's wisdom and Washington's warnings. And it really carried through until the First World War, when we had a debate between two Washington biographers, Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge, over whether we should get involved in the Second World War and then the League of Nations. And they both tried to invoke Washington to be on their side. Wilson won the debate about getting in the war. Henry Cabot Lodge won the debate about the League of Nations. But it started the trajectory of the farewell address being a bit forgotten. And then a really fascinating dark moment ripped out of the twilight zone in the lead up to the Second World War, where the farewell address really gets the sort of final insult because FDR violates the two-term tradition and plots to get us in another war without copping to it. There's a really horrific rally in Madison Square Garden, February 1939. And 20,000 American Nazis show up at a rally for the German-American Bund, and at the top of the stage is a 30-foot banner of George Washington flanked by swastika flags. And the keynote speech is a recapitulation of Washington's farewell, saying Washington told us to be religious, he told us to avoid excessive debt, and he told us to avoid foreign wars. And that, to me, is worth mentioning not only because the imagery of it itself, and there are pictures of it in the book, are so stunning that they look like a episode of The Twilight Zone, because it's a reminder of how the Founding Fathers' wisdom can be cherry-picked and twisted into the exact opposite of what it was meant to communicate. And when Washington spoke about pretend patriots, he couldn't have anticipated that specific situation. But the members of the German-American Bund were literally on Adolf Hitler's payroll. And here they were claiming to represent a more pure vision of Americanism to pursue, invoking the farewell address to pursue their own interests. So the farewell address fell out of fashion, and in its place, the Gettysburg Address came up, and it's a bit understandable. First of all, it's easier to memorize. It's only 272 words. But I think the speeches are best understood, and this is a former speechwriter, for Rudy Giuliani, who's on the board here, back in an earlier incarnation of my life, as the Old and New Testament of American politics. The farewell address are these rules of behavior dispatched by a distant God. And the Gettysburg Address is a rumination of life after death. And they're both beautiful. But the farewell address deserves to be remembered again right now. And presidents since have quoted it. Reagan on religion, Johnson on education. Barack Obama in his farewell address quoted it by extending the warning to threats to our democracy. I skipped over Ike, and I regret that because I like Ike. But his farewell address was all based on Washington's farewell, based on a warning about the rise of the military-industrial complex. And the memos we found from that time clearly state that he's using Washington as a template. So the speech continues to echo, but I think we need it now more than we have in a long time, to recognize that democracy is not a given. It's a birthright, as Ronald Reagan was fond of saying. It's always one generation away from being extinguished. And we have to have a fidelity to our founding fathers. We have to have a fidelity to our founding principles, understanding that principles are not rigid strictures, they're guides, but that we need to make the old stories new again as a society, that we need to stay in connection to the founding fathers' wisdom and update it and make it relevant for our own time. And this remains a document, Washington's wisdom as laid out here, conversations about the danger of excessive debt, and the importance of religion and morality might appeal to some folks on the right. The emphasis on religion and the emphasis on public education might appeal to some folks on the left. The importance of moderation as a governing virtue. But at the end of the day, it's a document that can appeal to people across the political spectrum. Because while the followers of Jefferson became Democrats and the followers of Hamilton became Federalists, the followers of Washington were all Americans. And that's wisdom that we can need to update for today. And I do think that particularly at this moment, we are crying out for a new generation of Washingtonians to dedicate themselves to first principles, but then project them forward, to define common ground and common purpose rooted in timeless wisdom that is now more timely than ever before, to recognize that we need to balance individual liberty and generational responsibility, to recognize that all our interesting differences do not make us divided in any fundamental way, and that we are ultimately always friends and fellow citizens. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you, John. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Just want you to know there isn't one note in front of him. He has his book in front of him, which he never opened.
That's true.
So that was amazing. John has offered to take some questions, so I hope you have some. I know many of you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I think there was a lot in there to jump off of. So
Please.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and please wait for a microphone because we are live streaming, and we want to be sure that our live stream captures your question right here in the second row. Wait for the microphone.
I think that Washington indeed was a person supporting term limits. And I'm wondering,
He started term limits.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
What would he say about that now, and what would he recommend we do to try to encourage that public service doesn't become a career, it becomes a public service that has a limit to a limit?
Sure. I'm always a bit wary to do the what would Washington do or say, because there are limits to which you can anticipate. But as you point out, I mean, he sets the two-term precedent. And by the way, that holds as part of the unwritten rule of the Constitution, which was sufficient until 1940. And then after FDR, it had to be formally written into the Constitution. But obviously, you're talking about Congress. You're talking about state legislatures. And I think your point is well taken. Washington and the Founding Fathers definitely drew on all their life experiences to make them more representative leaders. And Washington certainly understood it to be something to be done for a time. He was a reluctant president that wasn't opposed. And in part, his greatness was predicated upon the fact that he left power, not only as president, but after winning the Revolutionary War. When he resigned his commission, that itself was a revolutionary act. And at the time, they called the written speech he left, which was warnings again to Americans on the birthday, essentially, of the country after winning the Revolutionary War, that was often called his farewell address. And the ideas are total continuity. But he very much understood and valued the idea of citizens serving in government for a time, that it was to be seen as a sacrifice. It certainly was for him. He genuinely would have rather been on the banks of the Potomac. That was not a pose. And so to that extent, I think it's fair to say that he would have understood the importance of citizens serving in government for a time, that it should be something you do to give back. It should be a sacrifice for a time. And the idea that it would be coveted and held for decades and become a job in upon itself, I think, would have been alien to him, and certainly to the little r Republican principles that he tried to advance.
Okay, we had another one right back over there. Hold on for the microphone.
How would you balance Washington's view of no entangling alliances, no excessive debt, and nonpartisanship with the fact that the country did engage in extreme partisanship after him, extreme debt after him, and extreme entangling alliances, World War I, II, excessive.
So I was going to ask you, actually, what timeline are you looking at here? Are we doing the entire history of the Republic?
Post-Washington.
All right. Post-Washington, which is to say the entire history of the Republic. Look, I think that let's try to narrow the focus, just a little bit, at least with regard to partisanship. Something we hear a lot of that frustrates me is professional polarizers and partisans, particularly in partisan media, and also in politics, excusing extreme statements or actions on their own side by saying, well, this is a tradition that goes back to Adams and Jefferson, and you should have heard what they said in 1800, and Adams was called a hermaphrodite, and in fact, many of their angry debates and the skullduggery and the negative attacks in the partisan press do echo in some ways, some small ways, for what we see today. But I think what we forget is that those are supposed to be seen as cautionary tales. And even Adams and Jefferson came to regret it deeply, the divisions and the viciousness and the hatred between their supporters as well as themselves for such a period of time until they were again old men and began speaking and corresponding again. That's not the aspect of the Founding Fathers we should be emulating. That's what we should be using with a sense of perspective to realize that they were flawed human beings, and that's what makes them even more fascinating. I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we put them on a pedestal because we make their wisdom less accessible. But therefore, you need to understand that those moments when they bitterly fought and attacked each other in occasionally unmerciless terms, it's not something we should be proud of. It's nothing they were, in fact, proud of. And we certainly shouldn't use it to excuse extreme actions on either side today, and we do that too often. But look, the whole point Washington was making is that democracies reflect human nature, and human nature often will divide into factions. That's why we need to resist those impulses. We need to be wiser. We need to think a little bit bigger than narrow self-interest when it comes to politics in a democracy. When it comes to debt, nothing's easier than racking up big debt and passing it on to the next generation. But there's an obligation, as well as a recognition of basic math, that it's immoral to pass on excessive debts to future generations. And with entangling alliances, I'll just say that, again, Washington can't be held to anticipate every technological advance that has come in the subsequent 241 years. The oceans, I hate to break it to you, don't quite provide the security they once did. We certainly learned that at the outset of this century, if not 60 years before. But I think the key point to take is not to misinterpret his message as one of isolationism, but to use it as a message of peace through strength and a determined commitment to independence and pursuing our own interests. That's a message that itself is timeless. The fact that we fall from these standards that he set isn't surprising. The important thing is that we remember them.
Okay, I think we had one right here.
Thank you first for coming here.
Thank you.
To quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, FDR was a president who had a second-rate intellect but a first-rate temperament. Why is it that so many of our great presidents, whether it be Washington or Lincoln or both Roosevelts and Reagan, they were often perceived as having, quote-unquote, not the greatest intellect? Some of their cabinet members may have been more well-educated, but they had a first-rate temperament, and we regard them so highly.
Well, I think you're getting to something that ultimately is very comforting about democracy. But, Washington, the fact that he wasn't the sharpest wit at the dining room table had also something to do with his sense of a concept we don't see too much of today, but dignity and decorum and a concept of honor. Now, he was playing a role rooted in a military bearing. There's a great story. Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris are at a party with Washington. And Gouverneur Morris bets Hamilton that he can't go up to Washington and put his arm around him. And Hamilton said, you're on, pal. So Morris goes up to Washington and throws his arm around him and says, "General, it's so good to see you looking so well." It's pretty innocuous. Washington looks at him like he has a tentacle, and Gouverneur Morris slinks off. So he understood, I think, much more than most, but he was a self-monitoring man. I think the larger point is we underestimate Washington's wisdom today. I'm not sure his contemporaries did. It's very evident we've underestimated many presidents' wisdom, but wisdom and wit are not always the same thing. And there's a steady quality. There's a steering towards the horizon of being right in big things, realizing that nobody is perfect. You don't want necessarily people micromanaging aspects of policy. So for me, that's actually one of the liberating factors, that a democratic republic is supposed to elevate all sorts of different people, and they're different kinds of smart. And I think wisdom is one of the most underrated. Make sense? Okay.
Any other questions out there? Okay, I'm going to end with one.
Sure.
You have a great audience here. I know you've been on a book tour and you've had a lot of great audiences.
Only when I get a chance. This is fun for me.
What I want to know is if you've had a chance to deliver your message to those in power and who should hear it.
You mean currently in power, I meant.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, not yet. Actually, it's not entirely true, but look, I think certainly when I was writing the book, I had no idea what would happen in the election. But I think the reason the book seems to have resonated, and it's in a sixth printing now, is that there is something comforting about first principles in the Founding Fathers in a stormy time. We're looking for foundations. We're looking for something to hold on to. And the farewell address is timeless, but it's exceptionally timely right now. Now look, again, I started writing this 4 years ago, and the issues of hyper-partisanship, excessive debt, and foreign wars seem just as relevant and urgent to me. And the fact that we had this document from the Founding Father, to me, could sort of cut through all the noise and the spin. Because so often people try to co-opt the Founding Fathers to excuse their own agenda. And, you know, as an independent, as a centrist, it was comforting to me to see that the Founding Fathers so often were advocates of moderation, of warning about the dangers of overextension in politics and ideology and fiscal discipline and foreign affairs. It's not always a fashionable message, but it's a really important one. As I said, I think the Founding Fathers were very worried about the nation degenerating into factions, and they understood through their reading of history, it bears repeating, that if factions hijacked government, looking after special interest rather than national interest, it could lead to such a deadlocked democracy that citizens would become frustrated with the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of government to such a point that it could open the door to a demagogue with authoritarian ambitions. That's a lesson from history. But history is awfully useful in politics. History is what we got. That's where we have an obligation to learn it. And I'll say this about trying to make the old stories new in any number of different ways, and it's why the play Hamilton is such an important service in upon itself, because it does this so well, is that through any vehicle we have, by any means necessary, we need to elevate civic education again. You're never going to know where you're going unless you know where you've been as a nation, and there is a sacred trust between generations in a self-governing society. We have an obligation to learn the lessons of the past, and that doesn't mean whitewashing the past and imposing false perfection on those who've come before us. When I interviewed Lin-Manuel Miranda, the playwright for Hamilton, he talked very directly about, you know, you need to embrace the contradictions of the Founding Fathers. You know, that he set up the dialogue between Hamilton and Washington to be, Hamilton was speaking the words as prose, Washington elevated them into song, but here you had a man singing eloquently about freedom who owned other human beings. We need to address that. We need to deal with that, but then recognize that that's the sand in the oyster, and we need to understand all human beings, current fellow citizens or Founding Fathers, as flawed and interesting and offering things of great value. But we need to incorporate all of it into our understanding. It makes it all, that communion between generations, much more accessible, much more enduring. And the civic education part of this is urgent. Enlightened opinion is necessary to a self-governing society. No one would watch the Super Bowl if no one knew the rules. We have to inculcate it, and we can't simply wait for government to do it through funding, folks. It's got to start at the dinner table, but it also needs to extend to philanthropy. It's why presidential libraries, frankly, are so important as resources for teaching history and the drama of America and the adventure of the American experiment, which we should all feel majesty for. And we should hold our elected officials to a higher standard. That's utterly reasonable. We can do that without thinking that they need to be perfect, because then we're just setting ourselves up for disappointment. But there should be a deep working knowledge of American history and policies, because you're carrying forward a sacred trust, not only on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of future generations. It's essential that people in that office not think of themselves first, but to think about America, and not just their friends and fellow citizens, but their future generations. That's part of it. And I'll end with this, and this, I think, is if you're going to distill a large part of Washington's wisdom that we need to carry forward today to a single phrase, it would be this: our independence as a nation is inseparable from our interdependence as a people. Our independence as a nation is inseparable from our interdependence as a people. Washington knew that transformation of the way we thought about ourselves was essential to our life and liberty, and that liberty required a degree of self-discipline. That's important too. That's basic. But we need to inculcate that. We need to accept that responsibility willingly and then pass it on better than it was handed to us. That's a sacred trust. It's not just up to the president. It's up to all of us as citizens. Washington also understood that the backstop in a democracy is the citizenry. It's not our elected representatives. It's not even the President of the United States. It's we the people. It's been a great honor to be with you here today. Thank you.
John, thank you. Thank you all for coming. John has agreed to sign books.